the Caribbean. When you picture it, you likely think of stunning beaches, vibrant culture.
Beautiful.
Right.
Absolutely. Paradise.
But beneath the surface of that paradise lies a critical challenge: energy. These island nations are often heavily reliant on expensive and environmentally damaging fossil fuel imports.
And at the same time, they're right on the front lines,
Yeah.
facing some of the most direct and, frankly, devastating impacts of climate change.
Exactly. Okay, let's unpack this because today we're taking a deep dive into a really important piece of research: Defossilizing Caribbean's energy system, highlighting on e-fuel imports, grid integration, and accelerated transition. Quite a title.
It is. And what's fascinating about this study is its sheer ambition. I mean, it's the first really comprehensive look at how the entire Caribbean region, and we're talking about, what, 34 distinct island states?
That's right, 34.
How they can realistically achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. And it doesn't just offer one single solution.
No, it explores, I think, 17 different potential pathways.
17, yeah. Really digging into the roles of things like importing sustainable e-fuels, which is a big one, connecting the island's power grids, and also looking at the benefits and the challenges of maybe speeding up this whole energy transition.
Right, and the researchers didn't just, make guesses. This study, Defossilizing Caribbean's Energy System, highlighting on e-fuel imports, grid integration, and accelerated transition, it's built on solid foundations.
Techno-economic principles.
Exactly, using what are called techno-economic principles and this powerful modeling tool, the LUT Energy System Transition Model.
Think of it like a super sophisticated financial and engineering model. It crunches just massive amounts of data.
Hour by hour.
Hour by hour, yeah.
Yeah.
To figure out the smartest and, crucially, the cheapest way for the Caribbean to go green.
So our mission today is basically to cut through all that complexity and really understand the key findings. What does this study tell us?
Yeah, what are the takeaways?
So the fundamental question that this research grapples with, and what we'll be exploring today, is: can the Caribbean truly break free from its dependence on fossil fuels? Can it forge a cleaner, more secure energy future? Let's dive in.
Okay, well, to really get the significance here, you need to appreciate the unique circumstances of the Caribbean.
Right. It's not monolithic.
No, exactly. As this research points out, we're talking about a region made up of many individual island nations, each with its own economy, often quite concentrated, maybe in tourism.
Yeah, often relying on tourism and largely dependent on external sources for essential goods, services, and energy.
And that dependence, this study, Defossilizing Caribbean's Energy System, highlighting on e-fuel imports, grid integration, and accelerated transition, makes that crystal clear. It extends directly to their energy.
So you've got this collection of energy systems, often with isolated power grids.
Right, not connected.
A lack of diverse energy sources, so maybe just relying on one or two things. Power infrastructure that's often underfunded, maybe old.
Undercapitalized, yeah. And then there's the space issue. Limited land for big projects.
And on top of all that, a significant vulnerability to natural disasters, which seem to be getting worse.
It's a really challenging starting point, to say the least.
Yeah.
And what this study really hammers home is the sheer economic burden of this reliance on imported fossil fuels. It's not just an environmental problem. It's a major, major drain on their economies.
The numbers are pretty stark, aren't they?
They are. The research reminds us, like back in 2015, Barbados was spending nearly 7% of its entire GDP just on oil imports.
7%, wow.
And for Antigua and Barbuda, it was even more staggering, 12% of their GDP. And get this, a third of their foreign exchange earnings, just gone on fuel.
A third? That's huge.
And more recently, 2019, the Caribbean Development Bank reported that its borrowing members were importing over 85% of their commercial energy.
85%?
Yeah, costing them over $8 billion US. That's roughly 8% of their total GDP across those members. Those are enormous figures for relatively small economies.
Wow. Those numbers really do paint a stark picture. It's an economic imperative, not just an environmental one. So, okay, against that backdrop, what are the key drivers pushing the Caribbean towards exploring renewables, as this study, Defossilizing Caribbean's Energy System, highlighting on e-fuel imports, grid integration, and accelerated transition, details?
Well, there are several powerful forces kind of converging.
Yeah.
Firstly, and this is a big one, the cost of renewable energy tech, especially solar and wind, has just plummeted in recent years.
Right, they're getting much cheaper.
Making them increasingly competitive with fossil fuels. Sometimes even cheaper outright. Plus, you've got continuous technological innovation happening there, too.
Better panels, better turbines.
Exactly. Then, of course, the growing urgency of tackling climate change.
Yeah.
That's a huge motivator for these islands.
Understandably.
Then there's the crucial aspect of energy security, reducing that reliance on unpredictable global fossil fuel markets.
Well, the price swings that come with it.
Oh, yeah, the volatility.
Yeah.
And this study also mentions that the Caribbean community, CARICOM, they've already set some pretty ambitious renewable energy targets.
They have goals, yeah. But the reality on the ground.
Well, the current reality, as of 2021 data in the study, was that only about 12% of the electricity generated across the region actually came from renewable sources. So a gap between ambition and reality.
A big gap. But the potential is clearly there, right? This study, Defossilising Caribbean's Energy System, highlighting on e-fuel imports, grid integration, and accelerated transition, it emphasizes the region's abundant natural resources.
Oh, absolutely. Sunshine galore, plenty of wind in many places, and even geothermal potential in some areas.
It sounds like they're sitting on a gold mine of clean energy.
They absolutely are. But, and this is a key point the study makes, integrating large amounts of variable renewables like solar when the sun shines, wind when it blows into relatively small, isolated grids, that presents challenges.
Right, keeping the lights on reliably, grid stability.
Exactly. That's why this research looks really closely at various flexibility measures. Things like managing demand, when and how energy is used.
Demand response, yeah.
Deploying energy storage like batteries.
Right.
Connecting power grids between islands, that's a big one.
Interconnection.
Integrating the electricity sector with heating and transport, and exploring what are known as power-to-X solutions.
Okay, what's that? Power to X.
Basically, converting renewable electricity into other energy carriers, like green hydrogen or synthetic fuels. Useful for things that are hard to electrify directly.
Ah, okay.
And what's interesting is that this study indicates that many of these flexibility solutions, well, they haven't really been widely used in the Caribbean before, so there's a lot of untapped potential there.
And considering the limited land space on many islands, this study, Defossilising Caribbean's Energy System, highlighting on e-fuel imports, grid integration, and accelerated transition, it also digs into offshore options.
It does. Things like floating solar farms, putting PV panels on the water, wave energy converters, offshore wind turbines, even ocean thermal energy conversion, OTEC.
Exploring pretty much every avenue.
Trying to maximize the potential, especially for the blue economy, using those ocean resources sustainably.
Which makes sense.
Yeah. And it's important context to remember, as the study itself highlights, that despite these clear economic advantages and the huge renewable potential, the Caribbean has historically been one of the least researched regions globally when it comes to these high renewable energy transitions.
Really? Less studied than other places.
Yeah, this study cites another review that underscores this point, even while also concluding that, yes, 100% renewable systems are technically feasible and economically viable for American island nations. So this research is really breaking new ground in a critical but somewhat overlooked area.
So, this study, Defossilising Caribbean's Energy System, highlighting on e-fuel imports, grid integration, and accelerated transition, is specifically aiming to fill those knowledge gaps. What are the key research questions it's trying to answer?
Well, it tackles several important areas that haven't been fully explored before. Firstly, a lot of previous work just focused on electricity generation.
Just the power sector.
Right, without really looking at the whole picture, how energy is used across all sectors, like heating and transport. Secondly, many studies gave a snapshot, like here's what 100% renewables looks like, but didn't map out the actual step-by-step pathways to get there.
The transition itself.
Exactly. Geographically, research often focused on the bigger islands, maybe overlooking the specific challenges and opportunities of the smaller ones. Technologically, the potential of offshore floating renewables wasn't really investigated for the Caribbean context.
And the flexibility options.
Right. The crucial role of grid flexibility options wasn't adequately analyzed. And finally, this study uniquely examines the value proposition of producing sustainable e-fuels locally versus just importing them for these islands.
Yeah.
That's a key question.
That is a comprehensive list. So what makes this particular study, Defossilising Caribbean's Energy System, highlighting on e-fuel imports, grid integration, and accelerated transition, so innovative? What are its main contributions?
Well, first off, it's the first study to give a comprehensive assessment of the entire energy system across the entire Caribbean: power, heat, transport together with that really detailed hourly resolution.
Which is computationally intensive, I imagine.
Very. And it lays out specific pathways for the whole region to hit net zero carbon emissions by 2050. Secondly, it significantly advances our understanding of importing sustainable e-fuels for land-limited islands. It's the first detailed analysis asking, does it make more sense to make them there or bring them in for the Caribbean?
Okay, what else?
Thirdly, it adds to the global picture on how you connect power grids in archipelagos by really investigating grid flexibility in a fully renewable Caribbean. Fourthly, it specifically looks at floating solar PV potential in these land-constrained settings.
Right, the FTV.
And finally, it gives crucial insights into what happens if you try to decarbonize even earlier, say by 2040. And to do all this, they developed different scenarios.
The CPS, BPS, DPS.
Exactly. The current policy scenario, CPS, the best policy scenario, BPS, that's the ambitious one, and a delayed policy scenario, DPS, allowing for a thorough exploration of different possible futures.
Okay, so we have a good grasp of what this study is and why it's so important. Now let's delve into how they actually did this. What's the methodology behind defossilizing Caribbean's energy system, highlighting on e-fuel imports, grid integration, and accelerated transition?
So the core of their approach is that LUT energy system transition model, the LUT ESTM we mentioned.
The cost optimization tool.
Right. It's designed to figure out the most cost-effective way to meet the Caribbean's energy needs while transitioning to a fully sustainable system. And it does this by analyzing the whole energy system hour by hour across an entire year.
And it considers things like rooftop solar, too.
Yeah, it considers the potential for individual consumers, prosumers they're sometimes called, installing their own rooftop solar panels and battery storage, and also the shift away from, say, old fossil fuel boilers to sustainable heating options.
And what's the sort of fundamental challenge the model is designed to solve? What's the main constraint?
At its heart, it's about making sure that electricity supply perfectly matches electricity demand every single hour of the year.
Balancing the grid constantly.
Constantly. And that includes accounting for any electricity traded between islands if there are interconnections, plus the crucial role of energy storage batteries, pumped hydro, if available in balancing things out when solar and wind fluctuate.
And it looks beyond just electricity.
Oh, yes. It models how energy is used in heating and transport, too. It considers things like smart charging for electric vehicles.
Like charging when there's lots of cheap renewable power available.
Exactly. And even the potential for vehicle-to-grid, V2G, where EVs could feed power back into the grid when needed.
Okay, that's pretty sophisticated. So what kind of data did they feed into this model for the study? Defossilizing Caribbean's energy system, highlighting on e-fuel imports, grid integration, and accelerated transition.
A vast amount of data. Detailed technical and financial assumptions for a whole range of energy tech costs for generation, storage, transmission, conversion technologies.
Like electrolyzers for hydrogen.
Exactly. They included current and projected electricity prices, population data, what energy infrastructure already exists, and importantly, forecasts for future energy demand in power, heat, and transport.
Where did they get that demand data?
Drawn from various international energy agencies, like the IEA, IRENA, and existing research literature. And crucially, the study also factored in that the cost of financing these big projects and the weighted average cost of capital, or WACC, isn't static.
Ah, it changes over time.
It likely changes over the transition period, and it also varies across the 9 distinct sub-regions they defined within the Caribbean for the analysis. Financing costs aren't the same everywhere.
9 subregions, that's pretty granular. And this study, Defossilizing Caribbean's Energy System, highlighting on e-fuel imports, grid integration, and accelerated transition, it considers connecting the island's grids. How did they factor that in?
Yeah, they made an interesting comparison to the existing network of submarine fiber optic cables already connecting the islands for internet.
Which already exists, yeah.
Right. So the idea is, well, if you can lay fiber, you can probably lay power cables along similar routes. They even looked at sea depths, noting that while most existing subsea power cables are in shallower waters, some do operate at depth of thousands of meters.
So it's technically feasible.
Technically achievable, yeah. Challenging, but feasible.
And how did they account for the actual renewable resources, the sunshine and wind, in this study? Defossilizing Caribbean's energy system, highlighting on e-fuel imports, grid integration, and accelerated transition.
They used historical weather data, specifically from NASA, to generate really detailed profiles of potential electricity production.
Hour by hour again.
Hour by hour, location by location, For solar PV, concentrating solar power and wind turbines. For hydro, they used historical water flow data. And they also estimated the potential for other renewables like biomass, waste-to-energy, and geothermal based on established methods and available data.
Okay. Yeah, the title, Defossilising Caribbean's Energy System, highlighting on e-fuel imports, grid integration, and accelerated transition, specifically mentions e-fuel imports. How were those handled in the model?
Right. Recognizing that land is scarce on many islands for huge local production facilities, the study acknowledged that importing sustainably produced fuels, e-fuels, is likely going to be a crucial part of the mix.
Especially for things like planes and ships.
Exactly. They specifically focused on electricity-based Fischer-Tropsch liquid fuels, EFTL, and e-methane. They looked at the costs and logistics of importing these, probably via specialized ships, similar to how LNG is transported now.
But not hydrogen imports.
They decided not to include e-hydrogen imports in the analysis, mainly due to the significant technical hurdles and, frankly, the very high costs currently associated with shipping hydrogen in its liquid form. Maybe in the future, but not for this study's timeframe.
Got it. Okay, finally, let's revisit those different scenarios. Best policy, BPS, delayed policy, DPS, current policy, CPS. What were the key differences in the assumptions defining each one in Defossilizing Caribbean's energy system, highlighting on e-fuel imports, grid integration, and accelerated transition?
So the best policy scenario, BPS, that's the most ambitious one, aiming for 100% renewables by 2050. It had constraints like limits on how fast you can build new renewables each year.
Realistic growth rates.
Yeah, realistic but ambitious. A ban on new fossil fuel power plants after 2020, with some exceptions maybe for existing gas turbines needed for flexibility initially, a gradual ramp-up of e-fuels in transport, a cap on how much power individuals can generate themselves, the prosumer share, and a steadily rising carbon price.
Okay, that's BPS. What about DPS?
The delayed policy scenario DPS was less aggressive. Slower renewables deployment, still allowing some new fossil fuel plants to be built, a more gradual adoption of e-fuels, lower limits on prosumer generation, and a less stringent carbon price. Kind of a middle ground, but still aiming for significant change, just slower.
And CPS, current policy.
The current policy scenario, CPS, was designed to reflect basically continuing with existing policies and any already planned expansions using data from OLA, the Latin American Energy Organization.
So business as planned, more or less.
Pretty much. Lowest targets for renewables, allowing new fossil fuel plants, very slow e-fuel uptake, minimal prosumer generation, and importantly, no carbon pricing implemented.
And within the BPS, they looked at variations.
Yes, several variations within BPS to test sensitivities. Like, what if you have less land available for solar? What if grids aren't interconnected? What if imported e-fuels are cheaper or more expensive? And what are the effects of aiming for that earlier 2040 target instead of 2050? Lots of angles explored.
Okay, that gives us a really clear picture of the detailed work that went into this. Now we can get to the really compelling part, the key findings of this deep dive into defossilizing Caribbean's energy system, highlighting on e-fuel imports, grid integration, and accelerated transition. What were the major discoveries?
This study uncovers some truly significant trends. Yeah. Firstly, looking at the overall energy supply picture. Okay. Fossil fuels are totally dominant now.
No surprise there.
But the best policy scenario, BPS, and even the delayed policy scenario, DPS, both project this clear, decisive shift. After about 2030, renewable electricity really takes over as the primary energy source.
So a major structural change.
Huge. And interestingly, the research suggests that by 2050, the total amount of primary energy needed could actually be lower in the renewable-heavy BPS compared to both the fossil-heavy CPS and the mixed DPS.
Lower overall energy use.
The efficiency gains. Electrification is generally much more efficient than burning fuels directly for many applications. So in the BPS, renewable electricity accounts for a massive share, something like 83 to 97% of total primary energy supply by 2050.
Wow. And the main sources?
Solar PV and wind power really emerge as the dominant workhorses.
Okay, and what about the electricity sector specifically? This study, Defossilizing Caribbean's Energy System, highlighting on e-fuel imports, grid integration, and accelerated transition, really emphasizes electricity's central role in a decarbonized system.
Absolutely. The study projects a dramatic increase multiple times higher than 2020 levels in both the total amount of electricity generated and the total installed generation capacity in BPS and BPS by 2050.
More power needed overall.
Much more, partly because you're electrifying transport and heat. The CPS scenario, still relying heavily on fossils, sees much less growth in electricity generation.
And given the land constraints.
Right. Given limited land, the research really highlights the crucial role that floating solar PV FPV could play. It could supply a really significant chunk of the region's electricity.
Putting panels on reservoirs or near-shore areas.
Exactly. Now, in scenarios where they assumed more land was available, say 6% instead of 1%, then traditional ground-mounted solar farms, especially with trackers, become the dominant source.
So land availability is a key factor in the tech mix.
Definitely. But across the high renewable scenarios, it's clear. Solar PV and wind become the absolute leaders by 2050, supplemented by other renewables like hydro, bioenergy, geothermal where it makes sense.
And fossil fuels.
They remain significant only in the CPS scenario. The study also points out that the differences in total electricity generation across scenarios by 2050 are also influenced by whether energy imports are allowed and how many fossil plants are still running.
Okay. Grid stability is always a huge topic with high levels of solar and wind. What did this study, Defossilising Caribbean's Energy System, highlighting on e-fuel imports, grid integration, and accelerated transition, find about the need for storage and flexibility?
Yeah, energy storage emerges as absolutely essential, crucial for keeping the grid stable and reliable in the BPS and DPS where renewables dominate.
What kind of storage?
The study looks at various types of batteries, both utility-scale big batteries and smaller ones in homes and businesses. Also the potential for V2G, using EV batteries.
Vehicle to grid again.
Yeah. In the BPS, electricity storage use just explodes by 2050. Significant contributions from all these types. Heat storage also plays a pretty important role for balancing renewable heating systems.
And hydrogen storage.
Interestingly, yes. Hydrogen storage becomes relevant in BPS and DPS, mainly for providing high-temperature heat for industry and also as a buffer for producing those e-fuels.
Makes sense. And the CPS scenario. Less storage needed.
Much less need for storage in CPS, unsurprisingly.
Right.
Because you still have those dispatchable fossil fuel plants you can turn on and off easily.
Right.
But beyond dedicated storage tech, the study really underscores the crucial role the power grids themselves play in providing flexibility within islands.
How so?
Well, it finds this clear positive correlation between how much the grid is utilized for moving power around and the amount of wind generation, and also a correlation between solar PV and battery storage use, especially in scenarios with less wind.
So the grid acts like a buffer, too.
To some extent, yes. And importantly, the research identified 3 distinct patterns of potential electricity trading between the 9 subregions in the BPS, assuming interconnection.
Ah, so who trades with whom?
Yeah, it depends on things like land availability for solar and how much wind there is. But it pinpoints potential leading exporters, think Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and potential importers like Haiti and some of the smaller Eastern Caribbean islands.
Interesting. Okay, the title also highlights an accelerated transition. But before we get to that speed aspect, let's talk about how these changes impact the end-use sectors, heating and transport, according to Defossilising Caribbean's Energy System, highlighting on e-fuel imports, grid integration, and accelerated transition.
Okay, so for heat, the study shows a major shift in the BPS. The current reliance on fossil fuels for heating gradually fades out.
Replaced by?
Replaced by renewable electricity, used both directly, think heat pumps, electric boilers, and indirectly through those sustainable e-fuels for industrial heat needs. Sustainable bioenergy also plays a part.
So by 2050 in the BPS?
Direct electric heating is dominant, followed by heat from e-fuels and bioenergy. And because the system is integrated, you can recover waste heat from processes like electrolysis and e-fuel synthesis, boosting efficiency.
Smart. And transport.
Just similar story. A move away from fossil fuels through both direct electrification, basically, lots more EVs.
Electric cars, trucks, buses.
Exactly. And indirect electrification, using e-fuels for sectors that are harder to electrify directly, like aviation and shipping.
So how many EVs are we talking?
The number of EVs is projected to jump significantly in all scenarios, but the highest uptake by far is in the BPS.
And the fuel mix in transport by 2050 in BPS.
Direct and indirect electrification cover the majority of transport energy demand. EFTL fuels, e-hydrogen, e-methane play key roles for those harder sectors. In contrast, CPS still relies heavily on fossil fuels for transport.
Does overall transport energy demand change?
It grows in CPS and DPS, but actually sees a more moderate increase in BPS thanks to the efficiency gains you get from electrification. EVs are just much more efficient than internal combustion engines.
Right.
The study also maps out how the fuel supply evolves. Fossils dominate until the 2030s, then decline sharply in BPS, replaced by those e-fuels, especially e-hydrogen and EFTL. And the need for traditional liquid fuels like gasoline and diesel It sees a massive reduction in BPS by 2050.
Okay, that's a huge shift. Now let's talk money and emissions. What does this study, Defossilising Caribbean's Energy System, highlighting on e-fuel imports, grid integration, and accelerated transition, tell us about the costs and the greenhouse gas emissions? This is often the bottom line, right?
Absolutely, and this is where the findings get really compelling, maybe even counterintuitive for some. The study actually demonstrates that the best policy scenarios, the high renewable ones, achieve the lowest total annualized system costs by 2050.
Cheaper than sticking with fossil fuels.
Cheaper than both the current policy scenario, CPS, and the delayed policy scenario, PPS. The potential cost differences are significant. BPS could be 25% to 37% cheaper than CPS and 12% to 37% cheaper than DPS by 2050.
How does that work? Renewables still involve big investments, right?
They do. And the cost structure changes dramatically. In BPS and DPS, most of the cost becomes upfront capital investment CapEx in solar, wind, batteries, grids. But in CPS, the dominant cost remains the ongoing operational expense OpEx, primarily buying volatile fossil fuels.
So you shift from fuel costs to investment costs, but the total comes out lower.
Exactly. You're essentially locking in lower, more stable energy costs long term. The study also compares the levelized costs LCOE for electricity, LCH for heat, LCOE for final energy.
And what happens to the cost of electricity?
It sees a significant decline in BPS and DPS because you're using so much low-cost solar and wind. In fact, the LCOE in BPS could be substantially lower in 2050 compared to costs back in 2020.
That's a powerful economic argument.
It really is. Now, on the emission side, the picture is just as clear. The BPS scenarios show this sharp, decisive drop in CO2 emissions hitting near zero levels by 2040 or 2050, depending on the specific BPS variation.
And the other scenarios?
A stark contrast. The CPS actually sees a significant increase in emissions by 2050 compared to 2020 levels.
Wow, still going up.
Yeah. The DPS achieves some reductions, but still falls far short of the deep decarbonization of BPS. And if you look at cumulative emissions over the whole period, massively lower in the BPS pathways.
And the accelerated BPS aiming for 2040.
Even lower cumulative emissions. You avoid locking in emissions for that extra decade.
Okay, now this study, Defossilising Caribbean's Energy System, highlighting on e-fuel imports, grid integration, and accelerated transition, specifically examine the impact of those three things: e-fuel imports, accelerated transition, and grid interconnection. What were the key findings there?
Right, comparing variations of the BPS. Firstly, grid integration connecting the islands. The research found clear benefits.
Such as?
Lower overall annual system costs, a lower levelized cost of electricity, needing less total installed generation capacity because you can share resources, and lower cumulative CO2 emissions. Interconnection helps optimize the whole system.
Makes sense. What about e-fuel imports?
The study showed that scenarios allowing e-fuel imports resulted in significant reductions in overall system costs compared to scenarios where only locally produced e-fuels were allowed.
So importing can be cheaper than making it all yourself.
Potentially, yes, depending on global market prices versus local production costs. Importing also tended to lead to slightly lower installed generation capacity needs and lower cumulative emissions in the model.
And the accelerated transition, aiming for 2040.
Well, that one showed a trade-off. Pursuing that faster 2040 goal leads to higher overall cumulative costs over the period compared to the 2050 goal. You're compressing the investment into a shorter time frame.
More expensive upfront.
Right. But the significant benefit is achieving those lower cumulative greenhouse gas emissions. So it's a cost versus climate benefit trade-off.
Understood. And finally, this study, Defossilising Caribbean's Energy System, highlighting on e-fuel imports, grid integration, and accelerated transition, gives that regional outlook, breaking results down for the 9 subregions. Any key regional insights jumped out?
Yeah, looking at electricity generation by node in the interconnected BPS scenario, it identified Cuba, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic as the leading electricity producers by 2050, just due to size and resources.
And the tech mix varied.
It did. Offshore floating solar played a major role in many island groups. But some regions, like Cuba and the Turks and Caicos Bahamas Bermuda node, relied more heavily on ground-mounted solar and onshore wind in the model results.
And costs varied regionally, too.
Yes, the average LCOE differed across the nodes. Some, like the Dominican Republic, Cuba, and Jamaica, actually achieved costs below the overall Caribbean average in the BPS.
Interesting. What about fuel supply?
Again, Cuba, Haiti, and the DR were the top fuel consumers. And those sustainable e-fuels, e-hydrogen and EFTL together, made up a large percentage of the total fuel supply in these future scenarios.
And the electrolyzers needed for hydrogen?
The study estimated the required capacity, finding that Cuba and Haiti would need the largest installed electrolyzer capacity to meet that demand for hydrogen and derives e-fuels.
Okay, so bringing it all together then, what's the central message, the main takeaway from this really comprehensive deep dive into defossilizing Caribbean's energy system, highlighting on e-fuel imports, grid integration, and accelerated transition?
I think the overarching conclusion is remarkably encouraging, actually. It definitively shows that the Caribbean region really does possess the potential to completely transition away from fossil fuels.
It's feasible.
It's feasible to move towards a future that's not only cost-effective and reliable, but also fundamentally sustainable, built really on the strength of their own abundant renewable energy resources, especially solar power.
And the potential benefits go way beyond just cutting emissions, don't they?
Oh, absolutely. As this study, Defossilizing Caribbean's Energy System, highlighting on e-fuel imports, grid integration, and accelerated transition, clearly outlines this transition offers the real prospect of significantly lower energy costs.
Which we saw in the numbers.
Yeah, enhanced energy reliability and security, less reliance on those volatile imports, a dramatic reduction in that dependence, which has huge economic benefits, a crucial contribution to global climate efforts, and even this exciting opportunity to foster a vibrant blue economy through using their ocean resources sustainably.
It really does sound like a transformative opportunity, hitting multiple goals at once. And the key technologies and strategies that the study flags as crucial to make this happen.
It really underscores the pivotal roles of solar PV, both ground-mounted and floating, wind power, advanced battery storage, electrolyzers for green hydrogen.
The flexibility enablers.
Exactly.
Oh.
And the strategic interconnection of power grids between islands, plus the smart use of imported or potentially locally produced sustainable e-fuels. Those are the key building blocks.
So given these compelling techno-economic advantages that the study, Defossilizing Caribbean's Energy System, highlighting on e-fuel imports, grid integration, and accelerated transition, has laid out so clearly, the critical question now really becomes, what needs to happen next?
Yeah, the how.
What are the key policy decisions, the investment strategies that need to be implemented, maybe urgently, to actually accelerate the Caribbean's journey towards this wealth, this solar to X economy? What innovative financing mechanisms, what regional collaborations can unlock this immense potential and really ensure a resilient, sustainable energy future for all these island nations?
It's a lot to consider, definitely. Policy, finance, cooperation.
Yeah.
But as you say, the potential payoff identified in this study is just enormous.
It really is.
And for anyone listening who really wants to get into the nitty-gritty, the detailed data, the comprehensive analysis behind all these findings, we definitely encourage you to explore the full study itself.
Yeah, dive deeper.
Absolutely. It contains a real wealth of information that further reinforces these exciting possibilities for the Caribbean's energy future, as outlined in Defossilizing Caribbean's Energy System,
Yeah.
highlighting on e-fuel imports, grid integration, and accelerated transition.